Rain came hard and fast, like a wall falling from the sky. It hit the cliff face with a steady, angry drum. Wind tore at the trees and threw loose stones down the slope. Jonah ran with his pack tight against his chest, each step slipping on wet rock. He had been checking a relay tower when the storm arrived. The path back to the road vanished under a sheet of water and mud. He saw the cave mouth ahead, a dark hole in the cliff. It looked like a safe place. Jonah did not think of danger. He only thought of shelter and dry clothes. He crawled inside and pressed his back to cool stone. The cave smelled of old earth and salt. The storm roared outside, but inside the sound changed. It became smaller, like a far-off drum. Jonah set down his pack and tried to calm his shaking hands. He pulled out a small stove and some dry tinder. His fingers moved quickly, the way they always did when he was nervous. He made a small fire that threw a warm circle of light on the cave wall. The orange glow made the stone look alive for a moment, then the dark swallowed the edges again. He ate a cold ration bar and listened to the storm. Minutes passed. The fire burned low. At first there was only the drip of water and Jonah's breath. Then he heard a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was soft, like a long, slow exhale. He froze. The sound came again, closer this time, like someone moving in the dark. Jonah told himself it was an animal. He told himself it was his mind. He told himself many things to keep fear from rising. The sound became a whisper. It did not come from one place. It seemed to come from the stone itself, from the floor and the ceiling and the walls at once. The voice was low and old. It said, clear as a bell in the quiet, "You are the first feast in centuries." Jonah's skin crawled. He looked toward the black throat of the cave and felt the hair on his arms stand up. He tried to speak, but his voice failed. The whisper came again, softer, almost curious. "You smell of storm and blood. You are warm." The words were slow and patient, like something waking after a long sleep. He reached for his radio with hands that would not stop shaking. The device crackled with static. He called for help, voice thin. The radio answered with nothing but the storm. He tried to stand, to run back into the rain, but the cave floor felt wrong beneath his feet, as if it tilted toward the dark. The whisper laughed, a sound like pebbles sliding. "Stay," it said. "You will be the first." Jonah thought of the relay tower and the strange readings it had sent last week. He thought of old miners' tales about deep places and sleeping things. None of those stories had seemed real until now. The cave had not been empty. Something had been sleeping, and the storm had brought him to it. He moved deeper into the cave, following the whisper like a thin thread. The walls narrowed and the air grew colder. Strange marks scored the stone, lines that looked like writing but were not any language he knew. The whisper guided him, sometimes from the floor, sometimes from the ceiling, always patient. Jonah's small fire made the shadows dance. The dark seemed to watch him. He found a chamber where the roof opened to a thin shaft of pale light. In the center lay a hollow like a bowl. It was filled with bones. Some were long and thin, others thick and curved. Jonah's stomach turned. He stepped back and the whisper hummed with something like pleasure. The bones were old, bleached by time, but they were many. They told a quiet story of hunger. The voice told him a story in pieces. Long ago, before towers and cities, something had come to the deep places. It fed on travelers and on the heat of life. People fought it and trapped it with fire and iron. They sealed it away and left marks so others would not forget. Time eroded the warnings. The world grew loud and the old thing slept. "You woke me," the voice said. "You are warm. You are the first in 500 years. Jonah felt the weight of those words. 500 years was a long hunger. He thought of his small life and the relay tower he had climbed. He thought of the world above, busy and bright, and how little it knew of the dark below. The cave's hunger was not a single mouth. It was a slow, patient intelligence that used the stone and the bones to speak. It could mimic voices, call names, and make the lost feel at home. Jonah realized it had not only spoken, it had listened to the world for centuries, learning how to lure. He tried to bargain. He offered food, tools, anything he had. The voice answered with a memory of feasts and of the taste of fear. It did not want barter. It wanted the warmth of living flesh and the sound of a heart. Jonah felt the cold press in his chest. He had to think of a way to survive. Outside, the storm kept time. Inside, Jonah listened to the voice and to his own heart. He had to decide, stay and learn what the cave wanted, or run and risk the cliff and the lightning. The path back was gone. Curiosity, that stubborn human spark, burned as bright as his dying fire. He chose to stay, because he had no other choice and because he wanted to know what waited in the dark. The cave seemed to breathe around him. Shadows moved where no light reached. Jonah sat very still and watched the black mouth of the cave. The whisper did not sound angry. It sounded hungry and patient, as if it had waited a long time for this moment. He felt small and very alone, but he also felt something else, the sharp, clear edge of a plan forming in his mind. Jonah moved deeper into the cave with slow, careful steps. Each footfall sounded loud in the quiet, like a drumbeat in a church. The air grew colder the farther he went. His breath came out in white puffs that vanished into the dark. The small fire at his back left a warm circle that did not reach the far walls. Beyond that circle, the cave held its own lightless weather, a stillness that felt older than the storm outside. The stone changed as he walked. Smooth faces gave way to rough, ribbed walls. Strange marks cut the rock in long, shallow lines. At first Jonah thought they were scratches from falling stones. Then he saw patterns, curves and crosses that repeated like a language. He ran his fingers over one mark and felt a faint warmth under the skin of the rock, as if the stone remembered heat. The whisper moved with him, not loud but always there, like a thought at the edge of hearing. Jonah found a narrow passage that opened into a wide chamber. The roof rose high and the floor sloped down to a hollow in the center. Bones lay in the hollow like a careless pile of white driftwood. They were not all the same. Some were long and thin, like the ribs of a large animal. Others were thick and knotted, like the leg bones of something heavy. A few were small and delicate, the size of a child's arm. The bones were old, their edges were smooth and their color was the pale of old paper. Jonah felt a cold twist in his stomach when he saw them. The whisper came from the bones now. It sounded pleased. Warm, it said, and the word moved through the chamber like a breeze. Jonah stepped back and nearly slipped on a loose stone. He had to sit down on a low ledge to keep from falling. His hands trembled, not from the cold but from a fear that felt like a living thing inside his chest that he tried to think of a name for what he heard. It was not a voice like a person's. It was older, made of many small sounds layered together. Sometimes it sounded like a child calling, sometimes like a man singing, sometimes like the wind through a hollow reed. It could shape itself to what a listener expected. Jonah realized with a shock that the cave had learned to speak in ways that would make people come closer. He remembered the old stories his grandmother told him when he was a boy. She had spoken of deep things that lived under the earth, of bargains and seals and songs that kept the dark quiet. Jonah had laughed at those tales then. Now the stories felt like maps. The marks on the wall were not just decoration, they were warnings. The bones were not only remains, they were a record. The whisper told him a piece of its past in a voice that was not quite a voice. It spoke of a time when people lived closer to the earth, when they left offerings and sang to the deep places. It spoke of a pact, the people would give a little warmth and the deep thing would not reach up. The pact had been kept for many years. Then the world changed. People built towers and roads and forgot the old songs. Fires burned where they should not have. The seals rusted and the marks wore away. The deep thing slept and waited. You woke me, the whisper said again, but this time it sounded tired, not angry. You are the first in 500 years. Jonah thought of 500 years as a number he had read in books, not a thing that could breathe. The cave's hunger had been patient enough to count centuries. That patience made it more dangerous than any quick, angry beast. Jonah tried to ask questions, but the cave answered in images more than words. He saw flashes in his mind, a village by a river, people carrying torches, a line of iron driven into the ground, a circle of stones with red marks, a hand closing a heavy door. He felt the memory of heat and the taste of smoke. The cave showed him how it had been trapped, how people had used fire and iron and song to hold it down. It showed him how the seals had been broken by time and by carelessness. The bones in the hollow were not all from one time. Some were very old, some newer. Jonah found a small bone that looked almost fresh. It made his stomach drop. The cave had fed more recently than 500 years ago, or something else had been brought to it. The whisper hummed like a satisfied throat. You smell of storm, it said. You smell of the world above. You are warm. Jonah thought of the relay tower and the strange pulses it had sent. He wondered if the tower had called to the cave without meaning to. Machines made noise the old people could not have imagined. The cave had learned to listen to that noise and to use it. It had learned to shape the sounds into calls that would bring living things close. The thought made Jonah's hands go cold that he tried to bargain with the thing. He offered food, his tools, his radio. He promised to leave and never come back. The cave answered with a memory of feasts, the sound of bones cracking, the heat of a heart, the small bright panic of a living thing. It did not want tools. It wanted warmth and life. Jonah felt the truth of that like a physical weight. No amount of metal or plastic could replace what the cave wanted. Fear sharpened into a clear edge. Jonah knew he could not stay and wait for the cave to decide. He also knew the path back to the cliff was dangerous in the storm. The cave had the advantage of place and patience. Jonah had only his quick mind and the small fire that was already dying. He looked at the bones and then at the marks on the wall. He thought of the old songs and the iron seals. He thought of the relay tower and the way the world above made new noises. A plan began to form, small and fragile. If the cave could use sound to call, maybe sound could trick it. If the old people had used iron and fire, maybe those things could still help. Jonah felt a stubborn human certainty rise inside him. He would not be taken without trying. He would not let the deep thing learn to reach farther into the bright world. He stood up, his legs steady now with a new purpose. The whisper watched him, patient as ever, and the bones in the hollow seemed to listen. Jonah sat on a low ledge and breathed slowly. The cave's voice had shown him old memories and fresh bones. Now his mind worked like a machine, turning fear into steps. He thought of the relay tower on the ridge, the one he had climbed that morning. The tower had been acting strange for days, sending odd pulses into the sky. He had seen the patterns on his tablet before the storm. He wondered if the tower had called to the cave without meaning to. He pulled the tablet from his pack and wiped the mud from the screen with the back of his hand. The device still had power. Jonah opened the log and scrolled through the last transmissions. The pattern was there, a steady beat of short and long pulses, a rhythm that repeated like a song. He traced the pattern with his finger and felt a cold prickle run down his arm. The marks on the cave wall matched the rhythm. The cave had been listening to the tower. The whisper changed when Jonah touched the tablet. It moved through the device like water through a pipe. The cave had learned to use human noise. It could bend a machine's signal into a voice. Jonah realized the danger. The cave could reach out through the world's machines and call to people far away. It could make 1,000 small noises and shape them into a lure. He thought of the old miners' stories again. They had used iron and fire to hold the deep thing. They had also used sound, simple songs and rhythms, to warn and to bind. Jonah had tools and a small flare and a coil of wire. He had the tablet and the tower's pattern. He had one human mind that could think fast. He decided to try to trick the cave with its own language. Jonah set the tablet to replay the tower's pattern. He changed the pitch and speed, making a sound that was close but not the same. He wanted the cave to hear a feast that had already come, a false signal that would make it search elsewhere. He called it a mimic. He called it a lie that might save him. He tested the mimic quietly at first. The cave answered with a soft rustle, like leaves in a dry wind. The bones in the hollow shifted as if something small had moved among them. Jonah felt the cave's attention tilt. He raised the volume a little and added a higher tone, a sound that the cave had not heard in its long sleep. The whisper stuttered, confused by the new note. Jonah felt hope like a warm thing in his chest, but the cave was clever. It did not fall for a single sound. It layered voices, old and new, and it used memory to check the truth. Jonah needed more than a mimic. He needed a trap that would make the cave believe the feast was gone and that would keep it from finding him while he escaped or called for help. He gathered the bones from the hollow, careful not to touch the smallest ones. He arranged them in a ring and set dry tinder between them. He wrapped the coil of wire around the ring and connected it to the tablet's battery. The plan was simple and dangerous. When the mimic signal played, the tablet would send a burst of current through the wire and spark the tinder. The fire would be bright and hot, a false feast that would burn and smoke and look like a recent kill. The cave might accept the sight and smell and leave. Jonah worked with hands that did not stop trembling. He thought of the tower and the people who used it. He thought of the bright world above and how small his life had been until this night. He thought of the cave's patience and how it had waited centuries for warmth. He felt the weight of what he was about to do. If the trap failed, the cave would know he had lied and would come for him with all its slow hunger. If it worked, he might buy time for rescue. He set the tablet to play the mimic at full volume. The cave answered immediately, a chorus of whispers that rose like steam. Jonah hit the switch and the wire sparked. The tinder caught and the bones flared white. Heat rolled through the chamber like a wave. For a moment the cave's voice broke into many small sounds, like a crowd surprised. Shadows peeled away from the walls and the hollow glowed. The fire did not fool the cave completely. It tested the smoke and the sound, reaching with small threads of thought into the ring. Jonah felt the cave's curiosity like a pressure on his chest. Then the cave did something he had not expected. It tried to speak through the fire. The flames bent and shaped into a low, singing tone that matched the mimic. The cave was learning in real time, using the very trick Jonah had set. Panic rose hot and sharp. Jonah grabbed his pack and shoved it over the fire, smothering the flames. Smoke filled the chamber and made his eyes sting. He coughed and stumbled back. The cave's voice changed, softer now, like a thing that had been surprised and then amused. Clever, it said. Clever is food too. Jonah realized the trap had worked only partly. The cave had been distracted, but it had also learned. It had tasted the mimic and found the lie. It would remember the sound and the shape of the fire. It would use that memory to make better calls. Jonah felt a cold fear. He had taught the cave a new trick that he had one choice left for the night. He could try to run back to the cliff in the storm and hope the dark did not catch him. Or he could stay and find another way to bind the cave, to seal it as the old people had done. The path back was dangerous and the storm still raged. The cave had learned from his trap. Time was not his friend. Jonah sat on the ledge and listened to the cave's soft hum. The bones in the hollow were quiet now, but the memory of the fire hung in the air like a taste. He thought of the relay tower and the way machines could carry a voice. He thought of the marks on the wall and the iron seals the old people had used. He felt the stubborn human certainty again, sharper and colder. He would not let the cave learn to call the bright world freely. He stood and tightened his pack. The cave watched him with a patience that felt like a hand on his shoulder. Jonah moved deeper into the dark, not away from the danger but toward it, because he had to find the old marks and the old songs and the iron that might still hold. The storm outside kept time, and the cave waited, counting the beats between his steps. Jonah moved with a steady, careful pace. The cave watched him with a patience that felt like a living thing. He had a plan, small and dangerous, but it was the only plan he had. He would use the cave's own language against it. He would make a trap of sound and fire and hope the old hunger would be fooled long enough for him to act. That he gathered bones from the hollow, choosing the larger pieces first. The bones were cold and smooth under his fingers. He set them in a rough circle on the stone floor, spacing them like teeth. Between the bones he placed dry tinder he had kept in a waterproof pouch. He worked quickly, his hands moving on their own while his mind measured risk and time. The cave's whisper hummed around him, curious and slow, as if it watched a child build a toy. Jonah took the coil of wire from his pack and wrapped it around the bone ring. He tied the ends to a small battery he had salvaged from his tablet pack. The wire looked thin and fragile, but he trusted the spark it could make. He set a small flare in the center of the ring, the kind miners used for marking paths. The flare would burn hot and bright for a short time. If the cave believed the fire was a fresh feast, it might turn away. That he tested the tablet again. He had changed the pattern, added a higher tone and a slow, low hum that the cave had not heard in its long sleep. He set the device to loop the mimic and placed it near the bone ring. The tablet's screen glowed in the dark like a small moon. Jonah felt the cave's attention shift toward the sound. The whisper rose, layered with old voices and new, like wind through many pipes. When he was ready, Jonah hit the switch. The mimic played loud and clear. The cave answered with a chorus that rose and fell like a tide. Jonah watched the bones. For a moment nothing happened. Then the wire sparked. The flare caught. Flame licked the tinder and the bones glowed white. Heat rolled through the chamber and the smell of burning bone filled the air. The cave reacted at once. Shadows peeled away from the walls and moved toward the ring. The whisper became 1,000 small voices, excited and hungry. Jonah felt the pressure of attention like a hand on his chest. He had expected the cave to be fooled, to turn its hunger toward the bright fire. For a breath he thought his plan had worked. Then the cave did something he had not planned for. It reached into the fire with its voice. The flames bent and shaped into a tone that matched the mimic. The cave used the light and the sound together, testing the truth of the feast. Jonah saw shapes in the smoke, thin, reaching forms that looked like hands. They moved toward him, not through the fire but around it, as if the fire were a ring the cave could not cross. Panic rose like a hot tide. Jonah grabbed his pack and shoved it over the flare, trying to smother the flames. Smoke filled the chamber and his eyes burned. He coughed and stumbled back, but the cave's reach did not stop. The shadow hand slid along the walls and the floor, seeking a place where the fire's heat did not hold. Jonah felt one brush his sleeve like a cold finger. It left a chill that ran to his bones. That he ran, ducking under a low ledge and sliding down a slope. The cave's voice followed, soft and patient, like a hunter that had found a scent. Jonah's heart hammered. He thought of the old seals the miners had used, iron driven into stone, songs sung in a circle. He had no iron, no songs, only a coil of wire and a flare and a tablet. He had bought time, but he had also taught the cave a new sound. The thought made his stomach drop. The cave did not chase him in a straight line. It moved in slow, clever ways, testing his path and closing small doors of shadow behind him. Jonah found himself in a narrow passage where the walls leaned close. He could feel the cave's attention pressing from both sides. He pressed his back to the stone and tried to breathe quietly. The mimic still played on the tablet, a small, steady sound that filled the passage like a heartbeat. That a voice came close, so close Jonah felt the breath of it on his face. It was not a human breath. It smelled of damp earth and old things. You are clever, the whisper said. You make new songs. You teach me. The words were not angry. They were almost fond, like a teacher praising a clever pupil. Jonah felt a cold anger rise in him. He had not meant to teach. He had meant to survive. He thought of the people above, of the relay tower and the towns that used it. If the cave learned to use machines, it could call across the world. He could not let that happen. He had to find a way to bind the cave again, to make the old marks hold. He pushed himself forward, following a faint line of scratches on the wall that looked like the old marks he had seen in the chamber. The scratches led to a small niche where a rusted iron ring was set into the stone. Jonah's hands shook as he touched the ring. It was cold and rough, and it had been there a long time. He pulled at it and felt the stone give a little. The ring was part of an old seal, a piece of iron driven into the cave to hold something back. He looked around and found other rings, hidden in shadow, linked by grooves in the rock. The old people had not only used fire, they had used iron and shape to bind the deep thing. That he had no heavy iron to drive new rings, but he had wire and a coil and a stubborn will. He wrapped the wire through the rings he could reach and tightened it as best he could. It was a poor seal, but it was something. He sang a small song his grandmother had taught him, a simple rhythm of words that felt like a promise. The cave's whisper hummed in answer, not loud but listening. Jonah knew the seal would not hold forever. It might slow the cave, make it patient again. It might teach the cave to be more careful. But it would not end the hunger. He had bought time, and time was what he needed. He needed to get back to the tower, to warn people, to bring iron and songs and a plan that would last longer than his small coil of wire. He left the niche with the wire in his hands and the memory of the cave's breath on his face. The mimic still played, a small lie that had cost him more than he had thought. The cave had learned, and Jonah had learned with it. He moved toward the deeper dark, not away from danger but into it, because the only way to stop a patient hunger was to meet it with patience of his own and with the stubborn, noisy life of the world above. Jonah sat on a low ledge and watched the cave breathe. The small seal of wire he had wrapped through the old iron rings held for now, but it felt thin against a hunger that had waited centuries. The mimic had taught the cave a new sound. The flare had shown it a new light. Jonah had slowed it, not stopped it. He felt the weight of that truth like a stone in his chest. The cave's voice came to him in a softer tone than before. It did not rush. It spoke as if it had all the time in the world. You are clever, it said. You make new songs. You make bright fire. You are warm. The words were not a threat and not a promise. They were an offer, shaped like a question. Jonah felt the old stories return to him, the bargains made at river crossings, the pacts between people and things that lived below. He had never believed those tales until now. The cave was offering him a choice. Jonah thought of the world above. He thought of the relay tower and the towns that used it. He thought of the people who would climb the ridge in the morning to fix the lines and the children who would play near the cliff. He thought of the cost of silence and the cost of a single life. The cave's offer was simple: bring warmth and life, and the deep thing would sleep. Refuse, and it would learn to call the bright world more cleverly. The choice was cruel and clear. He tried to bargain with words first. He offered food, tools, anything he had. He promised to leave and never return. The cave answered with a memory of feasts, a taste of heat and the sound of bones. It did not want tools. It wanted the living warmth of a beating heart. Jonah felt the truth of that like a cold hand on his face. No amount of metal or plastic could replace what the cave wanted. The cave spoke of its long hunger in a way that made time feel thin. It told him of people who had once fed it small things to keep it quiet. It told him of a pact that had been kept for many years and then broken by carelessness and noise. It showed him images that were not pictures but feelings, a circle of people singing, iron driven into stone, a heavy door closed and sealed. The cave did not speak with anger. It spoke with the tired voice of something that had been patient for too long. Jonah felt a strange pity for the thing in the dark. It had lived a long time and had learned to wait. It had learned to listen to the world and to shape its calls. That pity did not make his choice easier. He could not trade the lives of strangers for his own safety. He could not become a keeper of hunger. He thought of the miners who had left marks in iron rings and songs. They had chosen to bind the deep thing, not to feed it. Jonah decided he would try to bind it again. He stood and walked back to the niche where the old iron rings were set. The wire he had wrapped through them felt thin, but it was a start. He found more rings hidden in shadow and pulled at them until the stone around them crumbled a little. He used his coil of wire to link the rings and to make a rough chain. It was not the work of a blacksmith, but it was work that used the old shapes. He sang the small song his grandmother had taught him, a rhythm of words that felt like a promise. The cave hummed in answer, listening. The cave offered him another thing then, knowledge. It said it could teach him the old songs that had once bound it. It could tell him how to make a seal that would last. The offer was tempting. If the cave would teach him how to bind it, then perhaps he could keep the world safe without giving it what it wanted. But the cave's knowledge came at a price. It wanted a teacher, a living voice to learn from. It wanted to feel the warmth of a human mind as it taught. Jonah understood the danger. Learning from the cave would be like feeding it with his own thoughts that he refused that offer too. He would not let the cave use him to learn how to call the bright world. He would not let it turn his mind into a tool. He would take what he could from the old marks and the iron rings and the songs he remembered, and he would leave the rest to the people above who had tools and numbers and strong hands. He would not bargain with the lives of others. The cave's voice grew quiet then, like a tide pulling back. It did not rage. It did not promise mercy. It said only, "You will be remembered." Jonah felt the words like a cold wind. He knew the cave would wait. It had waited 500 years. It could wait 500 more. The seal he had made might hold for a time. The marks he had found might warn others. But the cave had learned new sounds, and the world above made new noises every day. Jonah left the chamber with the wire in his hands and the memory of the cave's breath on his face. He climbed toward the ridge with a slow, steady step. The storm had passed and the sky was a pale gray. He felt the small seal of wire heavy in his pack, like a promise and a warning. He would go to the tower and tell the people what he had seen. He would ask for iron and for songs and for hands that could drive new rings into the stone. As he climbed, the cave's whisper followed him in small threads, not loud but always there. It did not call him back. It did not need to. It would wait. Jonah thought of the bright world above and of the stubborn, noisy life of people who built towers and roads and songs. He thought of the choice he had made and of the cost it might bring. He walked on, carrying the memory of the bones and the taste of the cave's patience, and he felt the clear, hard edge of a new purpose, to warn the world and to help it remember the old marks before the deep thing learned to call the bright world freely. Jonah climbed out of the cave as the sky lightened. The storm had passed and the cliff looked washed clean. He felt the cold of the cave still in his bones. His clothes were wet and torn, his hands raw from the wire and the stone. He paused on the ridge and looked back at the dark mouth he had left. For a long moment he simply breathed, tasting the clear air and the small, sharp relief of being above ground. He walked fast toward the relay tower. The path was muddy and the ground still slid under his boots, but he moved with a purpose that made his legs steady. He thought of the bones in the hollow and the way the cave had learned to use sound. He thought of the wire he had threaded through the old rings and the small song his grandmother had taught him. He had a plan, but he needed help. He needed iron and hands and people who would listen. At the tower, the technician on duty looked at him with a mix of suspicion and concern. Jonah's voice was rough from smoke and cold, but he spoke clearly. He told the man about the cave, the whisper, the bones, and the pattern in the tower's signal. The technician frowned and checked the logs. The pulses were there, small and strange, a rhythm that matched Jonah's story. The man called his supervisor and then the local authorities. Jonah watched as the small world of the ridge began to move. People did not believe him at first. They called him shaken, a man who had been in the dark too long. But the tower logs were real, and the old maps in the town archive showed a cave marked with a warning that had faded into a thin line. A small team formed, 2 miners who knew the old marks, a geologist from the university, a technician from the relay company, and a local officer. They climbed the ridge with tools and lights and a careful, skeptical air. Jonah led them to the cave mouth. He showed them the ring of wire he had left and the scratches on the wall. The miners' faces changed when they saw the marks. One of them, an old man with hands like split rope, muttered words Jonah had heard in his grandmother's songs. The geologist took samples of the stone and the technician checked the tower's logs again. They found the hollow and the bones and the place where Jonah had burned the flare. The team did not speak much at first. The cave's cold seemed to follow them into the light. That night, the team camped near the cave and listened. The cave did not speak loudly. It used small threads of sound that moved through the tower's signal like a ghost. The technician set up filters and recorded the pulses. The geologist found the old iron rings Jonah had used and traced the grooves in the stone. The miners sang the old songs Jonah had remembered, and the sound of their voices felt like a small shield in the dark. Word spread slowly. The town sent a message to the regional council. Scientists and engineers came with heavy tools and plans. They did not bring weapons. They brought iron, drills, and plans to rebuild the seals the old people had made. They brought people who could read the marks and who knew how to drive metal into stone without breaking it. Jonah watched them work with a quiet relief that felt like a small, hot thing in his chest. They worked for days. Men and women took turns at the mouth of the cave, driving new rings and setting heavy plates of iron across the opening. They wired sensors and set up a watch that would send an alarm if the cave's signal changed. The miners taught the younger workers the old songs and the rhythms that had once bound the deep thing. The geologist mapped the cave and found places where the stone had been shaped to hold the seals. The technician rewired the relay tower to block the strange pulses and to watch for any new patterns. At first the cave answered with small sounds, testing the new work. It tried to shape the tower's signal into a voice and found the filters blocking it. It tried to use the fire and the mimic and learned the shapes the people had used. The team tightened the seals and sang the songs until their voices were hoarse. They worked with a stubborn, human noise that filled the ridge and pushed back the patient dark. Jonah did not leave. He slept in a small tent near the mouth and kept watch with the others. He told his story again and again, and each time it sounded less like a single man's fear and more like a warning that needed to be heard. People listened. They brought iron and songs and a plan that mixed old ways with new tools. They did not promise to feed the cave. They promised to guard it. The world above changed in small ways. The relay company updated its protocols to watch for odd pulses. The town put signs on the trail and taught children not to wander near the cliff. The miners and the university wrote a short paper about the cave and the marks, careful with their words but clear in their warning. Jonah's name appeared in the report as the man who had found the hollow and who had started the work. He felt a strange pride that did not erase the memory of the bones. Even with the seals in place, the cave's whisper did not stop. It learned to be quieter, to hide in the small noises of the world. Sometimes, late at night, the technicians would hear a faint thread in the tower's signal, a sound like a breath that did not belong to the wind. The filters caught it and logged it, and the watchman would sing the old songs until the sound faded. The cave had not been destroyed. It had been contained. For now, Jonah changed too. The night in the cave had left a mark on him that was not only fear. He had seen how patient hunger could be, and he had learned how fragile the bright world was when it forgot the old marks. He taught the children the small song his grandmother had taught him and told them why it mattered. He helped the miners and the technicians and the geologist when they needed hands. He became a quiet keeper of the ridge, a man who watched and who warned. The last image of that season was of Jonah standing at dusk on the ridge, the sealed cave behind him and the relay tower humming. The town lights blinked below like small stars. He looked at the sky and thought of the long dark under the stone. The whisper was quiet, but it was not gone. It waited, patient as ever. Jonah felt the weight of that waiting and the stubborn, noisy life of the people who had learned to guard it. He knew the cave could wait 500 years more if it needed to. He also knew that humans could learn to remember, to sing, and to bind what they did not understand. The ridge held both the dark and the light, and for now, the light kept watch.